Disguised as an ordinary man, a billionaire enters his empire unseen. But when he finds his maid's daughter crying, the truth shatters everything he built. He pulled his cap low and stepped into the store that bore his family's name. Nobody looked twice. To them, he was just another old man in a frayed jacket. "Can I help you, sir?" a cashier asked politely. He smiled faintly. "No," he said. "I'm just looking around." He wasn't there to shop. He was there to listen. And what he heard stopped him cold. A soft, broken sob echoing from behind a janitor's closet door. A child's sob. The kind that doesn't come from a scraped knee, but from a soul that's learned to hide. In that moment, everything he thought he knew about his empire began to crumble. And what started as a quiet visit to his own store ended as the unraveling of a man's illusion. This is the story of how a billionaire vanished, to rediscover what it means to be human. And before I forget, where are you watching from today? Leave a comment below. We love seeing how far these stories reach. Enjoy the story. Harrison Gable was a man who trusted numbers, and the numbers said his company was perfect. But a single sound, a little girl crying in a forgotten corner of his store, was about to tell him the truth, a truth that would unravel a carefully crafted lie and challenge the very foundation of his life's work. Harrison Gable adjusted the brim of his worn-out tweed cap, pulling it low over his eyes. The hat felt foreign. For the last 30 years, the only thing he wore on his head was the immense, invisible weight of a retail empire. Gable's department stores were a titan of American commerce, a monument to his grandfather's vision and his own relentless drive. His face, usually gracing the covers of business magazines, was now carefully obscured, his tailored suit replaced by a simple, slightly frayed jacket and worn denim trousers. He looked like any other man in his late 60s, perhaps a retiree looking to pass the time or a grandfather waiting to meet his family. No one would ever guess he was the sole owner of the very ground on which he stood. He pushed open the heavy glass door of his flagship Chicago location, the bell above chiming a cheerful, metallic welcome that felt strangely out of place. This store, the crown jewel of his operations, was supposed to be a well-oiled machine of customer satisfaction and employee morale. The reports that landed on his polished mahogany desk in New York City painted a picture of perfection. Monthly summaries from the regional director spoke of record sales, low staff turnover, and glowing customer feedback. On paper, this place was a fortress of profitability and success. But Harrison hadn't come all this way to read another glowing report. He'd come because of a feeling, a cold, nagging suspicion that had taken root in his gut weeks ago. It started with a small thing, an anonymous, handwritten note that had somehow bypassed the corporate mailroom and landed directly on his desk. It was written on cheap, lined paper, the kind a child uses for schoolwork. The handwriting was shaky, desperate. It contained only 7 words. "Please look at what is happening here." There was no signature, no return address, just the store's number 101, scrawled at the bottom. His executives had dismissed it. Probably a disgruntled former employee, Mr. Gable, his CEO, had said with a wave of his hand. "We get these things from time to time. It's meaningless." But Harrison couldn't shake it. He had built his empire on the principle his grandfather had taught him. A business is a family, and you take care of your family. He had always believed that the polished floors and gleaming shelves of his stores were a reflection of the happy, dedicated people who worked there. The note suggested a crack in that foundation, a darkness he couldn't see from his penthouse office. So he had come, unannounced, disguised as a man who was invisible to the world. He wanted to see his store not as the CEO, but as a customer. He wanted to feel its pulse, to listen to its heartbeat. He walked past the gleaming cosmetics counters, the neatly arranged displays of menswear, and the cheerful chatter of shoppers. Everything on the surface appeared perfect, just as the reports claimed. The cashiers smiled, the floors shone, and the security guard by the door nodded politely as people came and went. For a moment, he felt a surge of relief. Perhaps his COO was right. Perhaps it was nothing. He was about to turn and leave, to dismiss his gut feeling as paranoia, when he heard it. It was a sound so faint it was almost swallowed by the store's ambient noise. The soft rock playing over the speakers, the rolling of carts, the murmur of conversation. But Harrison's ears, trained by a lifetime of listening for the things people didn't say, caught it. It was the sound of weeping. A child's weeping. It wasn't the loud, demanding cry of a toddler who had been denied a toy. This was different. It was a quiet, hopeless sobbing, the kind that comes from a place of deep hurt. He followed the sound, his heart beginning to beat a little faster. It led him away from the bright, open spaces of the main floor and toward a narrow, forgotten hallway tucked behind the home goods department. The sign on the wall read staff only, but the door to a small janitorial supply closet was propped open just a crack. The sound was coming from inside. Harrison hesitated for only a second before gently pushing the door. The closet was dark and smelled of bleach and floor wax. In the dim light filtering in from the hallway, he saw a small figure huddled in the corner. It was a little girl, no older than 9, with a cascade of blonde hair that fell over her face as she cried. She was sitting on an overturned bucket, her small shoulders shaking with each sob. Her knees were pulled up to her chest, and her face was buried in her arms. Beside her on the dusty concrete floor lay a half-eaten apple and a worn-out coloring book. Harrison's blood ran cold. The sight of this child, hiding and crying in a storage closet, felt like a profound violation of everything his stores were supposed to represent. He felt a surge of something he hadn't experienced in years, a deep, protective anger. This wasn't just a policy breach, it was a moral failure. He knelt down slowly, careful not to startle her. His joints ached in protest, a reminder of his age that he usually ignored. "Excuse me, little one," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "Are you all right?" The girl's head shot up. Her eyes were blue, red-rimmed, and filled with a startling mix of fear and sorrow. She quickly wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand, trying to compose herself with a maturity that broke Harrison's heart. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm not supposed to be in here. I'm supposed to be quiet." "It's okay," Harrison said gently. "You don't have to be quiet with me. My name is Harry. What's yours?" She hesitated, looking at this kind-faced stranger. "Chloe," she finally said. "That's a beautiful name, Chloe," Harrison said, offering a small, reassuring smile. "Can you tell me why you're crying? Did you get lost from your parents?" Chloe shook her head. She looked toward the closed closet door, as if afraid someone might hear. "My mommy is working," she whispered. "She told me to wait here and be a good girl. She said if Mr. Doyle finds me, she'll get in big trouble." The name hit Harrison like a physical blow. Frank Doyle, the store manager, the man whose signature was on the bottom of every one of those perfect, glowing reports. "Your mommy works here?" Harrison asked, keeping his voice calm. Chloe nodded. "She cleans the floors. She's a janitor. She works very, very hard. But she had to come in for an extra shift today. Mrs. Peterson, our babysitter, is sick, and we don't have money for another one. So Mommy told me to hide here. She said it would only be for a little while." Harrison's mind raced. An employee so desperate she had to hide her 9-year-old daughter in a supply closet while she worked? It was unthinkable. It flew in the face of every company policy he had ever signed off on. His company had a dependent care assistance program. They had emergency leave policies. Why wasn't this woman using them? "But why were you crying, Chloe?" Harrison pressed gently. "Did something happen?" The little girl's lip began to tremble again. A fresh wave of tears welled in her eyes. "I heard Mr. Doyle yelling at Mommy," she said, her voice cracking. "He was saying mean things. He said she was too slow and that she was lucky to even have a job. He said that people like us don't deserve second chances." Harrison felt his hands clench into fists at his sides. He had to force himself to stay calm, to keep the gentle grandfatherly facade in place for this child. "People like us?" he repeated. What did he mean by that? Chloe looked down at her worn sneakers. "I don't know. Mommy says we just have to be strong. She says that's what Grandpa would have wanted." She reached into the small backpack next to her and pulled out a faded, dog-eared photograph. It showed a man in a crisp military uniform, his chest adorned with medals, a kind but firm look in his eyes. "This is my grandpa," she said with a glimmer of pride. "General Robert Vance. Mommy says he was a hero. She says he always fought for people who couldn't fight for themselves." Harrison stared at the photograph. He felt the air leave his lungs. General Robert Vance. The name echoed through the halls of his memory. He wasn't just a hero, he was the hero. A legendary figure from the Desert Storm conflict, renowned for his courage, his integrity, and his unwavering dedication to his soldiers. Harrison had met him once, years ago, at a White House dinner. He remembered a man with an iron will and a deep sense of honor. A man who embodied the very best of America. And his daughter, his child, was working as a janitor in one of his stores, being berated by a petty tyrant of a manager while her own daughter hid in a closet, crying. The pieces of the puzzle began to click into place, forming a picture far uglier than he could have ever imagined. The anonymous note. The manager's perfect reports. An employee too scared to use the benefits she was entitled to. A war hero's daughter being told she didn't deserve a second chance. This wasn't a crack in his company's foundation. It was a rot, a sickness that had taken hold right under his nose. He looked at Chloe, at her tear-streaked face and the fierce pride she had for her grandfather. In her eyes, he saw the reflection of his own failure. He had built a kingdom of glass and steel, but he had allowed the people inside to become invisible. He had created policies meant to protect them, but he had fostered a culture where they were too afraid to use them. As he stood up, his knees cracking in protest, one terrifying question burned through his mind. If this was happening to the daughter of a national hero, what was happening to everyone else? What started as a simple fact-finding mission had just become the most important investigation of his life. The truth he was about to uncover would be worse than anything he'd imagined. It would force him to tear down the very systems he had built and question everything he thought he knew about leadership, honor, and the real cost of looking the other way. He looked down at the little girl, who was now carefully tucking the photo of her grandfather back into her bag. "Chloe," he said, his voice filled with a new, steely resolve. "I think your mom is the real hero. And I promise you, things are going to change." He had to get closer. He couldn't fix this from the outside. He had to go in, to see it with his own eyes, to live it. He had to become one of them. The decision was made. Harrison Gable, the billionaire CEO, was about to disappear. In his place, a man named Harry Gibson was about to apply for a job as a janitor. He walked out of the supply closet and back into the bright lights of the store, but he was no longer seeing the polished floors and perfect displays. He was seeing the shadows and the corners, the spaces between the shelves where desperation could hide. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he was about to find more than just one crying child. He was about to find a whole family of employees who were suffering in silence. The next 24 hours were a blur of calculated transformation. Harrison flew back to New York on his private jet, not to the comfort of his penthouse, but to a small, discreet office he kept for sensitive operations. There, with the help of his most trusted head of security, a former Secret Service agent named David, he began to construct his new identity. Harry Gibson was born. His backstory was simple, plausible, and designed to evoke a specific kind of dismissive pity from a man like Frank Doyle. Harry was a retired widower from a small town in Pennsylvania. His modest pension had been wiped out by a bad investment, and he had recently moved to Chicago to be closer to a fictional nephew. He was looking for simple, honest work to keep busy and make ends meet. He was quiet, unassuming, and desperate. He was, in short, the perfect victim. David worked his magic, creating a digital footprint for Harry Gibson. A simple social media profile with a few pictures of a generic-looking dog, a valid social security number flagged for temporary employment, and a driver's license with Harrison's picture, aged and weathered by a skilled graphic artist. They procured a set of second-hand clothes, worn work pants, faded flannel shirts, and a pair of sturdy but scuffed boots. Every detail was designed to scream, down on his luck, a man with no leverage, no connections, and no reason for anyone to look at him twice. The most difficult part for Harrison was the internal shift. He had to shed the skin of command he had worn for 40 years. He practiced in front of a mirror, slumping his shoulders, avoiding direct eye contact, speaking in a softer, more hesitant tone. He had to unlearn the habit of walking into a room and owning it. Now, he had to learn to disappear. He had to become the kind of man his own managers would overlook, dismiss, and ultimately, feel comfortable exploiting. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but he knew it was the only way to get to the truth. 2 days later, Harrison, now fully embodying Harry Gibson, walked back into the Chicago store. This time, he didn't enter as a customer. He went around to the staff entrance at the back of the building, a grim, metal door next to a row of overflowing dumpsters. The air here smelled of stale garbage and despair. He took a deep breath and stepped into the world his employees inhabited every day. He asked a passing stock boy where he could find the manager's office. The young man grunted and pointed down a long, dimly lit corridor without even making eye contact. The contrast between the bright, welcoming sales floor and this bleak, forgotten hallway was stark. This was the store's underbelly, the part the customers never saw. Frank Doyle's office was at the end of the hall. The door was closed, but a small, smudged window offered a glimpse inside. Harrison saw a man in his late 40s, with thinning hair slicked back with too much gel and a paunch that strained against the buttons of his cheap, polyester shirt. He was leaning back in his chair, feet up on his desk, barking into the phone. Even from a distance, his body language radiated a cheap, aggressive arrogance. This was a man who enjoyed his small kingdom. Harrison knocked softly on the door. There was no answer. He knocked again, a little louder this time. "What?" Doyle's voice boomed through the door. "Can't you see I'm busy?" Harrison opened the door a crack. "Excuse me, sir," he said, pitching his voice to sound meek. "I was told you might be hiring. I can come back later if this is a bad time." Doyle eyed him up and down, a flicker of contempt in his eyes as he took in Harry's worn clothes and weathered face. He held up a finger, signaling for Harrison to wait, then finished his call with a loud, fake laugh. He slammed the phone down and gestured toward the single, uncomfortable-looking chair in front of his desk. "What do you want?" he asked, not as a question, but as a demand. "I'm looking for work, Mr. Doyle," Harrison said, clutching a folded, fabricated resume in his hand. "Anything you've got. I'm a hard worker. Don't mind getting my hands dirty." Doyle took the paper without looking at it, placing it on a corner of his messy desk. "Experience. Worked in a warehouse for 20 years back in Pennsylvania," Harrison said, reciting the backstory David had created. "Company downsized. I'm just looking for something steady." Doyle leaned back, steepling his fingers over his stomach. He seemed to enjoy making Harrison squirm in the silence. "We don't have much," he said finally. "Maybe some hours on the night crew. Custodial. It's tough work. Long hours. Not for everyone." He said it like a challenge, as if daring Harrison to back down. "That sounds fine, sir," Harrison said, making sure to keep his eyes lowered. "I'm not afraid of hard work." Doyle smirked. It was a cold, predatory expression. "The pay is minimum wage. No benefits until you've been full-time for 90 days, and full-time hours are not guaranteed. You get paid for the hours you work, nothing more. You're late, you get docked. You're slow, you get docked. You complain, you get replaced. Understand, every word was a violation of Thompson Enterprises' official corporate policy. Full-time status was supposed to be determined by a rolling average of hours. Benefits were to be offered proactively, and docking pay for anything other than time fraud was strictly illegal. Harrison felt a cold fury rise within him, but he forced it down, nodding his head like an eager puppy. "Yes, sir. I understand completely," he said. "I just want a chance to prove myself." "Good," Doyle said, a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. He had found another compliant cog for his machine. "You can start tonight, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. You'll be working with Eleanor. She'll show you the ropes." He gestured dismissively toward the door. "Now get out. I've got work to do." As Harrison walked back down the grim hallway, he felt a strange mix of disgust and triumph. He had gotten in, but the ease with which it had happened was terrifying. Doyle hadn't asked for references. He hadn't conducted a real interview. He had seen a desperate older man, and his only thought was how he could be used. He spent the rest of the day in a cheap motel room he'd rented near the store, the anonymity of it a perfect match for his new persona. He thought about Eleanor Vance, the general's daughter. He thought about Chloe, hiding in that dark closet. He now understood why she was too afraid to use the company's support systems. A man like Frank Doyle wouldn't just deny a request for emergency leave. He would see it as a weakness to be punished. He had created a culture of fear so absolute that his employees would rather suffer in silence than risk speaking up. That night, at 9:45 p.m., Harrison returned to the store. The last of the shoppers were filtering out, their bright, cheerful faces a world away from the reality he was about to step into. He entered through the staff door and found his way to a small, grim break room. A few other night shift workers were there, sitting in silence, their faces etched with a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. No one spoke. They just stared blankly at the wall or scrolled through their phones, conserving their energy for the long night ahead. At 10 o'clock sharp, a woman walked in. She was slender, with the same quiet dignity he'd seen in her daughter's face. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her janitorial uniform, though clean, was faded and worn at the seams. Her eyes, the same piercing blue as Chloe's, held a deep sadness, but also an unbreakable strength. It was Eleanor Vance. She scanned the room, and her eyes landed on Harrison. "You must be the new guy," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "Harry, right?" Harrison nodded. "That's me. A pleasure to meet you. I'm Eleanor," she said, offering a tired but genuine smile. "Welcome to the night shift. It's not glamorous, but it's a job." She looked him over, a hint of concern in her eyes. "You sure you're up for this? It's a lot of walking. A lot of lifting." "I'll manage," Harrison said. "Lead the way." As they walked out onto the now empty sales floor, the store was transformed. The bright, welcoming space of the day had become a vast, cavernous world of shadows and echoes. The only light came from the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lamps overhead. The silence was immense, broken only by the squeak of their own shoes on the polished floor. It felt like a different world, a secret world that existed only after the customers went home. Eleanor led him to the janitorial closet where he had first found Chloe. It was even more cramped and disorganized than he remembered. She handed him a mop and a bucket. "We start with the main floors," she explained. "We have to get them done before the waxing machine comes through at 2 a.m. For the next 2 hours, Harrison worked. He mopped, scrubbed, and polished, following Eleanor's efficient, practiced movements. He was a man who hadn't done a day of manual labor in 4 decades, and his body protested immediately. His back began to ache, his hands grew sore, and sweat beaded on his brow. But he pushed through the pain, determined to see this through. He watched Eleanor as they worked. She moved with a grim determination, never wasting emotion, her face a mask of concentration. She rarely spoke, but when she did, it was to give him a quiet word of advice or a small tip on how to do a task more easily. He saw the way she limped slightly on her left leg, a subtle sign of chronic pain she was trying to hide. He noticed the raw, red skin on her hands, chapped from constant exposure to harsh chemicals. Around midnight, he saw the first clear sign of Doyle's systematic cruelty. "Eleanor," he asked, his voice echoing slightly in the empty store. "This floor cleaner seems weak. We've gone over this section twice, and the scuff marks are still there." She glanced over her shoulder, checking to make sure they were alone before she answered. "He cut the supply budget again last month," she said in a low voice. "Says we're being wasteful. We're supposed to dilute the concentrate, 1 part cleaner to 10 parts water. The bottle says it should be 1 to 3. Harrison looked at the industrial-sized jug of cleaning fluid. The instructions were printed clearly on the label. Doyle wasn't just cutting costs. He was forcing his employees to work 3 times as hard to get the same result, all to make his budget numbers look better on a report. It was a small, petty cruelty, but it was a deliberate one. An hour later, at 1:15 a.m., Frank Doyle made his first appearance of the night. He didn't walk. He prowled. He moved through the darkened aisles like a predator surveying his territory, his hands in his pockets, a smug look on his face. He found them in the food court, wiping down tables. He didn't address them directly at first. He just ran a finger along the surface of a table Eleanor had just cleaned, inspecting it for dust. He found none, but it didn't seem to matter. "Vance," he said, his voice sharp, "you're behind schedule. You should have been done with the food court 20 minutes ago." Eleanor's back stiffened. "We've been working as fast as we can, Mr. Doyle," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "The new guy is still learning the routine." Doyle scoffed. "Excuses. I pay you to work, not to train. And definitely not to be slow." He pulled out a small notepad from his pocket and made a mark. "I'm docking you both 15 minutes. Maybe that will motivate you to pick up the pace." He turned and walked away without another word. Harrison stared after him, his heart pounding with a rage so intense it made his vision swim. 15 minutes of pay, stolen from them for a completely fabricated reason. It was probably less than $5 for each of them. It wasn't about the money. It was about the power. It was about reminding them who was in control, that their time, their labor, their very livelihood, was his to give or take away at a whim. He looked at Eleanor. Her face was pale, but her expression was one of grim resignation. This wasn't new to her. This was normal. "Does he do that often?" Harrison asked, his voice barely a whisper. She nodded. not looking at him. She just picked up her cleaning cloth and moved to the next table. You learn to live with it, she said, her voice hollow. You have to. When you've got a little girl at home depending on you, you learn to live with a lot of things. Harrison gripped his mop handle, the wood groaning under the pressure. He had thought he was coming here to fix a problem in his company. But as he stood there in the vast, empty silence of his own store, watching a hero's daughter endure this quiet, soul-crushing abuse, he realized he had been wrong. This wasn't a problem. This was a war. And he had just enlisted on the front lines. The first break came at 2:30 a.m. Eleanor led Harrison to the same grim break room from before. Two other members of the night crew were already there, a wiry young man who looked barely out of his teens and an older, stooped man with weary eyes and a permanent tremor in his hands. The young man was scrolling silently on his phone, his face illuminated by the pale blue light. The older man, whose name tag read George, was staring into a thermos cup as if it held the secrets of the universe. The silence was heavy, oppressive. It wasn't a comfortable silence between colleagues. It was the tense quiet of strangers on a prison bus. Harrison sat down at the small table, his muscles screaming in protest. He unwrapped a simple sandwich he'd brought in a brown paper bag. The act felt strangely performative, a detail from the life of a man he was pretending to be. So, Harrison said, trying to inject a bit of warmth into the chilly room. How long have you all been working here? The young man didn't even look up from his phone. George took a slow sip from his thermos, his hand shaking slightly. He looked at Harrison with eyes that had seen too many long nights. Long enough, George said, his voice a gravelly whisper. Best thing you can do, Harry, is keep your head down. Do the work. Don't ask questions. Don't cause trouble. Just be invisible. Good advice, Eleanor said quietly, not looking at either of them. She was nibbling on an energy bar, eating it with the mechanical efficiency of someone refueling a machine, not enjoying a meal. Suddenly, the door swung open and Frank Doyle filled the frame. A greasy smile was plastered on his face, but it didn't reach his eyes. His gaze swept over the room, a silent accounting of his subjects. Well, look at my hard-working night owls, he said, his tone dripping with false bonhomie. Enjoying your little break? Don't get too comfortable. He pointed a thick finger at a clock on the wall. 15 minutes. That's what the company gives you. I'm timing it. To the second. He remained by the door, arms crossed, watching them. The air grew even thicker. The young man put his phone away. George seemed to shrink into himself, hunching his shoulders as if to ward off a blow. Harrison felt a primal urge to stand up, to walk over to Doyle and wipe that smug look off his face. He imagined telling him exactly who he was, watching the color drain from the manager's face as the reality of his situation crashed down upon him. But he couldn't. Not yet. Revealing himself now would be a momentary satisfaction, but it wouldn't fix the deeper problem. Doyle would be fired, yes, but the culture he created would linger. The fear he instilled in these people wouldn't just vanish. To truly heal this place, Harrison needed to understand the full extent of the sickness. He needed evidence. He needed the trust of the people Doyle had been terrorizing. He forced himself to take a bite of his sandwich, the bread feeling like sawdust in his mouth. After what felt like an eternity, Doyle grunted. Time's up. Back to work. Those floors aren't going to clean themselves. As they filed out of the room, Harrison saw Eleanor stumble slightly. She caught herself on the doorframe, a quiet gasp of pain escaping her lips. Her limp, subtle before, was now much more pronounced. The long hours on the hard concrete floor were taking their toll. They were assigned to clean the employee bathrooms next, a task Harrison suspected was reserved for Doyle's least favorite workers. The bathrooms were in a deplorable state, far worse than the public restrooms. It was another small, hidden indignity, another way of communicating to the staff that their comfort was of no concern. As they worked in silence, Harrison noticed Eleanor's movements becoming slower, more labored. She leaned heavily on her mop, her face pale and beaded with sweat. He saw her wince as she bent down to scrub a stubborn spot near the base of a sink. Are you all right? He asked, his voice low. I'm fine, she said through gritted teeth, but it was a clear lie. Just a long night. Harrison made a decision. He looked down the empty corridor. Doyle was nowhere in sight. Eleanor, he said, his tone gentle but firm. Go sit in the break room for 10 minutes. I'll finish in here. She looked at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of suspicion and exhaustion. I can't. If he finds out. He won't find out, Harrison insisted. I'm a fast worker. I can handle this. Go on. It's not a request. She hesitated, a battle playing out on her tired face. It was the conflict between her ingrained fear of Doyle and the overwhelming need to rest her aching body. Finally, the exhaustion won. She gave him a small, grateful nod, her pride not allowing her to say thank you. She limped out of the bathroom, leaving Harrison alone with the buckets and the bleach. He worked with a speed and fury he didn't know he possessed. The work wasn't just about cleaning anymore. It was an act of defiance. Every tile he scrubbed was a blow against Doyle's petty tyranny. Every surface he polished was a small gesture of respect for the woman who was supposed to be doing this job. He finished both bathrooms in under 20 minutes, a job that should have taken the two of them closer to 40. When he found Eleanor back in the break room, she was sitting with her eyes closed, her left leg propped up on a chair. She had taken her shoe off, and he could see her ankle was swollen. She opened her eyes as he entered, a look of gratitude finally breaking through her guarded expression. "Thank you, Harry," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You didn't have to do that. We're a team, aren't we?" Harrison said, sitting down across from her. "That's what this is supposed to be about." She let out a short, bitter laugh. "There are no teams here. There's just surviving." She looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. She saw the genuine concern in his eyes, the kindness in his weathered face. He wasn't like the others. He wasn't beaten down like George or checked out like the young man. He had a strength about him, a quiet dignity that reminded her of someone she had lost long ago. "Why are you here, Harry?" she asked, her voice soft. "A man your age, you should be retired, enjoying your grandkids." Harrison stuck to his cover story. "Lost my pension. A man's got to work. Same as anyone else." He paused, then decided to take a chance, to open a door he hoped she would walk through. "But what about you? I get the sense you weren't always doing this kind of work." Her gaze dropped to the floor. The wall she had so carefully constructed around herself began to crumble. His small act of kindness had done what no amount of pressure could have. It had made her feel safe. "No," she said quietly. "I wasn't." She began to speak, the words tumbling out as if a dam had broken. She told him about her life before this. She had been a paralegal at a small law firm in the city. It wasn't a glamorous job, but she was good at it. She had benefits, regular hours, and enough money to provide a stable life for her and Chloe. Her husband, Chloe's father, had been a firefighter, a good man who had died in a tragic training accident 3 years ago. After he died, she said, her voice thick with unshed tears, everything fell apart. The grief, it was like a physical weight. I couldn't focus at work. I started making mistakes. Small things at first, but they added up. Then Chloe got sick. A really bad case of pneumonia. She was in the hospital for almost 2 weeks. She took a shaky breath. I used up all my vacation time, all my sick leave. My boss was understanding at first, but then he started getting impatient. I had to take unpaid leave to be with her. When I finally came back, they told me they'd eliminated my position. Harrison felt a familiar, cold rage building in his chest. It was a story he had heard in different forms over the years. A loyal employee, hit by personal tragedy, being cast aside by a company that saw them as a liability on a balance sheet. "I was unemployed for 6 months, Eleanor continued. The savings ran out. The debt piled up. I was getting desperate. I applied for everything. No one would hire me. They saw the gap in my resume and assumed the worst. Finally, I saw an ad for this job. It was a night shift, but it was a job. It was a paycheck. It was a way to keep a roof over Chloe's head." She finally looked up at him, her blue eyes shimmering with a pain that cut him to the core. "When Mr. Doyle hired me, he made it very clear he was doing me a favor. He knew my situation. He said he was giving me a second chance that no one else would. And he has never, not for a single day, let me forget it." Now it all made sense. The taunt Chloe had overheard. People like us don't deserve second chances. Doyle wasn't just a bully. He was a predator who fed on desperation. He had found a vulnerable person and had systematically broken her down, using her past misfortune as a weapon to ensure her compliance. "He knows I can't afford to lose this job," she whispered. "He knows I have no other options. So I take it. I take the docked pay, the extra hours, the insults. I take it all, Because my little girl needs me to. Every night, I come here and I swallow my pride. I just tell myself what my father always used to say. What was that? Harrison asked gently. He was a general in the army, she said, a flicker of the pride he'd seen in Chloe appearing in her own eyes. He used to say, dignity is the one thing no one can take from you. It's something you carry inside. But some nights, Harry, some nights I feel like there's nothing left inside to carry. Harrison Gable, the titan of industry, the man who commanded boardrooms and moved markets with a single phone call, sat in a dingy break room in the middle of the night, utterly humbled. He was listening to the daughter of General Robert Vance, a man he deeply admired, describe how her spirit was being ground into dust by a petty tyrant in one of his own stores. The policies he had written, the corporate values he had espoused, the entire benevolent empire he thought he had built, it was all a lie. A fiction. Down here, in the trenches, none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was the absolute power of one cruel man over the lives of the people who worked for him. He wanted to tell her everything. He wanted to tell her that her nightmare was almost over, that the man sitting in front of her owned the very floor they were sitting on, and that he was going to bring the whole rotten structure crashing down on Frank Doyle's head. But he held his tongue. His plan had to be methodical. It had to be perfect. For Eleanor, for Chloe, for George, and for all the others who were suffering in silence. He needed more than a confession. He needed undeniable proof that would stand up to any corporate lawyer Doyle might hire. The end of the shift was approaching. The first hint of dawn was beginning to soften the edges of the dark Chicago sky. The night crew gathered near the time clock, a collection of exhausted, shadowy figures waiting to be released. Harrison stood with them, feeling a strange sense of camaraderie. He was one of them now. Their fight was his fight. Just as they were about to clock out, Doyle appeared one last time. He was holding a white cloth. He walked directly to a section of the main aisle, a high-traffic area they had spent hours cleaning and polishing. He bent down and wiped a small, almost invisible smudge on the floor. It was a mark so faint that Harrison was certain it hadn't been there an hour before. It looked suspiciously like a smudge deliberately made by the sole of a greasy work boot. Doyle's work boot. He held up the cloth, showing a faint dark streak. He addressed the group, but his eyes were locked on Eleanor. "What is this?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm. "I thought I paid you people to clean. This is unacceptable. This is laziness." No one said a word. The air crackled with fear and resentment. "This reflects poorly on all of you," Doyle continued, his voice rising. "But leadership is about accountability. And the senior member of this team is you, Vance." He pointed a finger at her. "So you will be the one to take responsibility. You're staying. I want you to remop this entire main aisle. On your own time. You can clock out when it's done to my satisfaction." It was the final, brutal straw. An hour of unpaid, punitive labor, assigned publicly to humiliate her in front of her colleagues. It was illegal. It was immoral. It was evil. The other workers averted their eyes, shuffling their feet. George stared intently at the floor. The young man was already backing away toward the door. They were abandoning her. Not because they wanted to, but because they were terrified that Doyle's wrath would turn on them next. Harrison watched Eleanor's face. He saw her spirit finally break. Her shoulders slumped in defeat, and she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. She was going to do it. She was going to accept this final humiliation because she felt she had no other choice. But Harrison Gable had a choice. He had been patient. He had been methodical. He had gathered testimony. But this public, cruel display of power was a declaration of war he could not ignore. He still couldn't reveal his identity, not yet. But he could send a message. He took a step forward. "I'll stay and help her," he said, his voice quiet but ringing with an authority that made everyone, even Doyle, turn to look at him. Doyle's eyes narrowed. "What did you say, old man?" "She's tired," Harrison said, his gaze as hard as granite. "Her ankle is injured. I'll stay and do it. You can take the time out of my check." A collective gasp went through the small group. No one had ever talked back to Frank Doyle. It was unthinkable. Eleanor looked at Harrison, her eyes wide with terror for him. Doyle took a step toward Harrison, his face turning a blotchy red. He was a foot taller than Harrison and 30 years younger, and he puffed out his chest, trying to use his physical presence to intimidate. "You've been here for one night, you old fool," Doyle snarled, getting right in Harrison's face. You don't get to make the rules. You want to be a hero? Fine. You're fired. Get your things and get out. Now, he turned to Eleanor. And you can thank your new friend for this. You're fired, too. The words hung in the air, cold and final. Eleanor's face crumpled. It was her worst fear realized. The job that had been her prison was now the lifeline that had just been cut. All because a kind old man had tried to stand up for her. Harrison felt a strange sense of calm descend over him. Doyle had overplayed his hand. He had just created the perfect opportunity. You can't fire us, Frank, Harrison said, his voice devoid of any of the meekness he had been feigning. He used the manager's first name, a calculated move to strip away his authority. Doyle laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. Oh, I can't. Watch me. Security, he bellowed toward the front of the store. That won't be necessary, Harrison said. He reached into his worn jacket and pulled out his wallet. He didn't take out an ID. He took out a simple, elegant black business card. He held it out for Doyle to see. The card had only 3 things on it: the Gable's department store logo, a name, and a title. Harrison Gable, Chairman and CEO. Doyle squinted at the card, his brain slowly processing the information. He looked from the card to Harrison's face, then back again. The contempt on his face slowly melted away, replaced by a wave of confusion, then dawning horror. The color drained from his cheeks. He began to tremble. No, he whispered. It can't be. Frank, Harrison said, his voice now filled with the ice-cold command of a CEO who was about to liquidate a failed asset. You are not firing anyone, but you are going to give me your keys, your employee ID, and your security codes. You are then going to go to your office and wait for me. Do not touch anything. Do not call anyone. Do not even breathe too loudly. Is that understood? The other employees stared, their mouths agape. Eleanor looked at the man she knew as Harry, this quiet, kind janitor, and saw him transform before her very eyes into someone else entirely. The slumped shoulders were gone. He stood tall, radiating a power that was more intimidating than Doyle's cheap bullying could ever be. It was the power of absolute, unquestionable authority. Doyle, his face ashen, could only nod. His reign of terror was over, and the man who had ended it was the one he had dismissed as a worthless old fool just minutes before. The sun was rising, and a day of reckoning had finally arrived at Gable's department store. The transition from a powerless, terrified minion to a man holding a pair of worthless keys was instantaneous and brutal for Frank Doyle. He seemed to shrink before their eyes, the cheap polyester of his manager's uniform suddenly looking like a costume on a man who had forgotten his lines. He fumbled with the key ring on his belt, his hands shaking so violently he could barely unclip it. He handed the keys and his ID badge to Harrison, his eyes darting around the small group of employees, looking for a sympathetic face and finding only a sea of cold, hard stares. The fear he had so expertly cultivated had now turned on him. His authority, built on a foundation of intimidation, had vanished the moment a higher power appeared. Harrison took the keys without a word and then turned his attention to the shell-shocked employees. Everyone, he said, his voice now calm and steady, projecting a natural authority that Doyle could only ever mimic with volume. Please, clock out. Go home and get some rest. Your full shift will be paid, and I am personally adding a 4-hour bonus to each of your checks for tonight's work. George, I want you to go home, and I want you to see a doctor about that tremor. Send the bill directly to my office. We will take care of it. George looked up, his weary eyes filling with tears. For the first time in years, someone was seeing him not as a broken-down old man, but as a human being. He could only nod, his throat too tight with emotion to speak. Harrison then looked at Eleanor. Her face was a canvas of conflicting emotions, shock, relief, and a dawning, brilliant hope. The weight of years of anxiety and fear was visibly lifting from her shoulders. Eleanor, Harrison said, his voice softening. You are not fired. On the contrary, I need your help. But first, I need you to go home to your daughter. Spend the day with her. Don't worry about anything here. When you're ready, I'd like you to come back this afternoon. We have a lot to talk about. He then added, and please, for your ankle, take a company car. The keys are in the office. Just tell the driver where to go. She looked at him, the man she knew as Harry, and saw the truth of his character. It hadn't been an act. The kindness, the decency, the willingness to stand up for her, that was the real man. The CEO persona was just the tool he was now using to enforce that character upon the world. "Thank you," she whispered, the words carrying the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights. "Thank you, Harrison." As the other employees filed out, whispering amongst themselves, a new and unfamiliar energy buzzing between them, Harrison turned his gaze back to Frank Doyle. The blood was beginning to return to Doyle's face, and with it, a hint of his old arrogance. He seemed to be calculating, searching for an angle, a way to spin this. "Mr. Gable, sir," Doyle began, his voice slick with a sycophancy that was even more repulsive than his bullying. "I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding. I run a tight ship. My numbers are the best in the region. I was just trying to maintain discipline. A little bit of pressure, that's all. It's how you get results." Harrison looked at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words were as sharp and as cold as shards of glass. "You're right about one thing, Frank. There has been a terrible misunderstanding. You misunderstood what this company is about. You misunderstood what a leader is. And you fundamentally misunderstood the difference between discipline and cruelty." He gestured for Doyle to precede him down the long, grim hallway toward the manager's office. "Walk," he commanded. Once inside the cluttered office, Harrison closed the door. The room suddenly felt very small. He didn't sit down. He stood in the center of the room, forcing Doyle to remain standing as well, a subtle power play that stripped the manager of any remaining sense of control. "I have spent the last 8 hours, Frank," Harrison began, his voice low and dangerous, "living in the world you created. I mopped your floors with diluted cleaning fluid to save a few pennies on your supply budget. I cleaned your filthy employee bathrooms. I watched you steal 15 minutes of pay from people who are breaking their backs for minimum wage. I listened to a good woman, the daughter of a national hero. Tell me how you used her personal tragedy to control her, how you ground her down day after day until she felt she had no dignity left." Doyle began to sweat, his eyes wide with panic. "She's lying. They're all lazy. They'll say anything to get out of doing their work. Do I look like a fool to you, Frank?" Harrison cut him off, his voice like the crack of a whip. "I built a multi-billion-dollar enterprise from the ground up. I can smell a liar from a mile away, and right now, this room stinks of your deceit." Harrison walked over to the desk and picked up a framed photograph. It showed Doyle standing with his arm around the regional director, both men grinning, holding up a plaque for Manager of the Year. "Your numbers," Harrison said with a sneer, tapping the photograph with his finger. "You want to talk about your numbers? Let's talk about them. How many workplace injury claims have been filed from this store in the last year?" "None," Doyle said quickly, a flicker of pride in his eyes. "My safety record is perfect." "Your safety record is a lie," Harrison shot back. "George has a repetitive stress injury from years of operating the floor buffer without proper support, but he's too scared to report it because he knows you'll fire him. Eleanor has chronic pain in her ankle from working on these hard floors with inadequate footwear, but she pushes through it because she needs this job to feed her child. You haven't created a safe workplace. You've created a workplace where people are too terrified to admit they're in pain. That's not a good number, Frank. That's a human rights violation." He threw the picture frame onto the desk, the glass shattering with a sharp crack. Doyle flinched as if he'd been struck. "You are a cancer in this company, Frank," Harrison said, his voice dropping to an intense, final whisper. "And I am the surgeon who is about to cut you out. You are terminated, effective immediately. You will be escorted from this building by security. Your final paycheck will be mailed to you, and it will be for the exact hours you worked, not a second more. If you ever set foot on any Gable's property again, you will be arrested for trespassing. But that's just the beginning." He leaned in closer, his eyes boring into Doyle's. "I have a team of auditors on a plane from New York right now. They will be here by noon. They are going to go through every piece of paper in this office, every email you've ever sent, every time clock entry you've ever approved. I am going to find every single penny you have stolen from your employees, and I am going to get it back for them. Then, I am going to turn over my findings to the Department of Labor. You have not just been a bad manager, Frank. You have been a criminal, and you are going to face the consequences." The last of Doyle's bluster evaporated. He was left with nothing but the raw, pathetic fear of a man whose world had just been utterly and completely destroyed. He collapsed into his chair, a broken, defeated man. Harrison turned his back on him and walked out of the office, leaving Doyle to stew in the ruins of his petty kingdom. He found the store's head of security, a decent man who seemed genuinely shocked by the night's revelations, and gave him clear, simple instructions for Doyle's removal. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the polished floors of the empty store, Harrison Gable sat alone in the manager's office. But he wasn't sitting in the chair. He was on the floor, on the other side of the desk, where Eleanor and others would have been forced to sit. He wanted to feel what they felt. He looked around the room, not as a CEO, but as an employee. He saw the cheap, particle board furniture, the buzzing fluorescent light, the single, dying plant in the corner. This was the room where spirits were broken. This was the heart of the darkness he had allowed to grow in his own house. The day was a whirlwind of activity. The auditors arrived, a team of sharp, no-nonsense professionals who descended on Doyle's office like a SEAL team on a mission. The regional director was summoned, a man who flew in on the corporate jet looking concerned, but who Harrison quickly realized was guilty of the worst kind of managerial sin, willful ignorance. He had been happy to accept Doyle's glowing reports and Manager of the Year awards because it made his own job easier. He had never once bothered to dig deeper, to ask the hard questions, to talk to the people on the night crew. He was fired before lunch. By late afternoon, Eleanor returned. She had slept, showered, and changed into a simple but professional dress. The transformation was remarkable. The exhaustion was gone from her eyes, replaced by a quiet, determined light. She no longer looked like a victim. She looked like her father's daughter. Harrison met with her in the office, but he had them bring in comfortable chairs and a pot of fresh coffee. He treated her not as an employee, but as a consultant. For 2 hours, he just listened. She told him everything. She told him about the broken equipment they were forced to use, the lack of proper safety gear, the way Doyle would change the schedule at the last minute, making childcare a nightmare. She told him about the culture of silence, how employees were pitted against each other, discouraged from talking or forming friendships. She painted a complete, devastating picture of a workplace ruled by fear. When she was finished, Harrison looked at her, his heart filled with a profound sense of respect. "Eleanor," he said, "I have a proposal for you. I am creating a new position in this company. It's a national role, the Director of Employee Welfare. This person will report directly to me. They will have the authority to travel to any store, at any time, unannounced. They will talk to employees, listen to their concerns, and investigate any and all claims of misconduct. They will be the voice of the people who work on the floor, a voice that goes directly to the top, with no managers to filter it. I want that person to be you." Eleanor was stunned into silence. She stared at him, her mind struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what he was offering. A week ago, she was a paralegal. A day ago, she was a janitor. And now this. "Me?" she finally said. "But I don't have any experience in corporate management. I don't have an MBA. "You have something more important," Harrison replied. "You have lived it. You know what it's like to be invisible. You have the integrity of your father and the strength of a survivor. You have more qualifications for this job than anyone I could ever find at a business school. The company needs you, Eleanor. I need you." Tears welled in her eyes. But this time, they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of validation, of a life's worth of struggle and quiet dignity finally being seen and rewarded. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Yes, I'll do it." 3 months later, the Chicago flagship store was a different place. The grim break room had been renovated, with comfortable chairs, a new kitchen, and bright, warm lighting. The equipment was all brand new, and the supply closets were fully stocked with the proper, undiluted cleaning fluids. But the biggest change wasn't physical. It was in the air. The employees smiled. They talked to each other. The oppressive weight of fear had been lifted. Eleanor Vance, now the Director of Employee Welfare, walked through the store on one of her regular check-ins. She wore a sharp, professional suit, but she moved with the same quiet grace she'd had as a janitor. She greeted every employee by name, from the cashiers to the stock boys to the new night crew supervisor, George, who now stood straighter, his hand steady. Her office was the one that had once belonged to Frank Doyle. She had redecorated it completely, replacing the intimidating desk with a round table to show that everyone who entered was an equal. On her wall, next to her new title, hung the framed photograph of her father, General Robert Vance, his chest full of medals, his eyes full of pride. Later that afternoon, a small, blonde-haired girl with bright blue eyes skipped into the office. She ran straight to Eleanor and gave her a hug. "Mommy, can we go to the park now?" Chloe asked, her voice bubbling with the carefree joy of a child who no longer had to hide in closets. "In a little bit, sweetie," Eleanor said, kissing the top of her head. "There's someone here I want you to meet." Harrison Gable stood up from the round table where he had been waiting. He was back in his tailored suit, the uniform of a CEO. But his eyes were different. The hard, calculating edge was gone, replaced by a warmth and a humility he had learned on his hands and knees, scrubbing floors. He knelt down, just as he had in the supply closet 3 months ago, so he was on eye level with Chloe. "Hello, Chloe," he said with a gentle smile. "My name is Harrison. I'm a friend of your mom's." Chloe looked at him, her head tilted. "You look different than Harry," she said with the unfiltered honesty of a child. Harrison chuckled. "Sometimes, you have to look a little different to see things clearly. I wanted to thank you." "For what?" she asked. "For crying," he said simply. "Your tears, your story about your grandpa. You reminded me what's really important. You helped me fix a very broken thing. You're a hero, just like your grandpa." Chloe beamed, a radiant, beautiful smile that lit up the entire room. As Harrison watched Eleanor leave with her daughter, hand in hand, he felt a profound sense of peace. He had spent his life building an empire of things, of stores, of products, of profits. But in the quiet sob of one little girl, he had been reminded that his true business was people. He had torn down a part of his own company to save it. He had fired executives, rewritten policies, and invested millions in new programs for employee support. But the most important change had happened within himself. The undercover billionaire had walked into his store to find a problem. He had walked out having rediscovered his own soul. And that's where we'll end the story for now. Whenever I share one of these, I hope it gives you a chance to step out of the everyday and just drift for a bit. I'd love to know what you were doing while listening. Maybe relaxing after work, on a late-night drive, or just winding down. Drop a line in the comments. I really do read them all. And if you want to make sure we cross paths again, hitting like and subscribing makes a huge difference. We are always trying to improve our stories, so feel free to also drop your feedback in the comment section below. Thanks for spending this time with me.